What if the vegetables that could support your kidneys were never sitting on a pharmacy shelf, but growing in gardens thousands of years ago, named right there in scripture? Most of us reach for a pill the moment something feels off, chasing whatever diet trend promises a quick fix. But long before any of that existed, the Bible was already naming the plants people leaned on to stay strong. Today, we're walking through 12 of them, ranked from good all the way up to something that might genuinely surprise you. Number 6 was the ration a fugitive king ate while running for his life through the wilderness. And modern nutrition is only now confirming why it matters. And number 1 is the very seed Scripture uses to describe manna itself, the bread that fell from heaven for 40 years. So hit subscribe, because every week we connect ancient wisdom with modern science. Let's get into it. Picture the heat of the desert sun, and imagine craving just one thing. Something cool, something wet, something that feels like relief in your mouth. That's cucumbers, sitting at number 12 on our list today. In the book of Numbers, chapter 11, verse 5, the people of Israel cried out, remembering the cucumbers they used to eat back in Egypt, alongside melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. It's one of the few places in Scripture where an entire meal gets mourned like a lost friend. There's a practical reason cucumbers could grow so reliably in a hot climate like Egypt's. They need constant water, and the Nile's irrigation canals made that possible in a way the open desert never could. That's part of why, once the Israelites left, cucumbers became something they simply couldn't recreate out in the wilderness. It wasn't nostalgia. It was genuine, physical craving for a food their new environment couldn't provide. Here's what's interesting. Cucumbers are almost entirely water, something like 96% of their weight, which is exactly what makes them so easy to overlook. We don't think of something that watery as medicine, but that high water content is precisely why cucumbers have traditionally been valued as a gentle, natural way to support healthy fluid balance in the body. The kind of quiet, everyday support your kidneys are working with around the clock. Traditionally, people have eaten cucumbers raw, sliced into water, or blended into cold soups during the hottest months, treating them less like a side dish and more like a daily reset. Modern nutrition research points to their potassium content as part of that same story, supporting healthy fluid levels alongside that near-total water base. The enemy here isn't some villain in a lab coat. It's simply forgetting. We filed cucumbers away as a garnish, a slice on the side of a sandwich, when the people wandering through the desert remembered them as something worth weeping over. Before you move on, a quick note. Everything in this video is shared for educational purposes only, so please talk with your doctor before making any changes to your diet or treatment. Now, from a food people cried over in the desert, let's move to the one they remembered right alongside it. You just heard cucumbers named in that same verse, but they didn't travel alone. Right after cucumbers, that same crowd in the wilderness listed melons in Numbers chapter 11 verse 5 as something else they missed from their old life in Egypt. Melons don't get much attention in most retellings of this story, probably because they've always played backup to something showier. But think about what it actually meant for a caravan crossing sand and heat to name melons among the very few foods worth grieving. That tells you something about how prized they were. Egypt at that time was known for growing enormous, sweet melons along the Nile, watered by the river's yearly flooding, and traders carried them for their size and their strength. Transporting melons across a desert wasn't easy either, given how heavy and fragile they are, which makes their appearance in this specific complaint even more telling. These weren't small conveniences people missed. They were foods that required real effort to grow and carry. Foods worth the trouble because of how much relief they offered in brutal heat. Here's the twist most people miss. Melons carry an even higher water content than cucumbers, often above 90%. along with a meaningful dose of potassium in every serving. Traditionally, that combination has made melon a food people reached for during the hottest, driest stretches of the year, treating it almost like nature's own way of replenishing what sweat and sun take away. Modern nutrition research has picked up on that same pattern, noting that foods with this kind of water and potassium profile may support healthy fluid balance, the same quiet work your kidneys are doing every single hour of the day. And yet, melon usually shows up at a summer barbecue, cut into cubes, treated as a light dessert instead of what it once was, a food people wept over the loss of in the middle of a desert. That's the real shame of it. Not that melon isn't good for you, but that we've quietly downgraded it to an afterthought. Let's carry that same idea of quiet undervaluing into our next food, because the next one on this list has been treated even worse. Have you ever cried over food? Not because it moved you, but because it physically stung your eyes? That's the strange, almost funny connection onions carry all the way back to Numbers chapter 11, verse 5. The same verse where cucumbers and melons appear. The people of Israel named onions specifically among what they missed from Egypt. And it's hard not to smile at the timing, because onions are still, thousands of years later, the one food guaranteed to make you tear up before you even taste it. Historians believe onions were so central to the Egyptian diet that laborers building some of the great structures of that era were partly paid in onions and garlic, treated almost like currency you could eat. Archaeologists have even found onions placed inside Egyptian tombs, tucked into the eye sockets of mummified remains, believed to help preserve the body or carry symbolic power into the afterlife. Whatever the exact belief behind that practice, it shows onions were seen as far more than a simple flavoring, valuable enough to be part of how people prepared for death itself. There's a reason for that, beyond flavor. Onions are rich in a compound called quercetin, and research has linked quercetin to healthy inflammation responses in the body, which matters because ongoing, low-level inflammation is something your kidneys have to quietly manage over time. Traditionally, onions have also been used as a gentle support for the urinary tract, often taken as a broth or lightly cooked into soups, rather than eaten raw for that purpose. Modern research has also looked at onions in relation to healthy blood pressure, since balanced blood pressure is closely tied to how well your kidneys can do their filtering work over time. Onions remain one of the most cultivated vegetables on the planet today, grown on every inhabited continent, which makes it almost strange that a food this universal carries a backstory tied directly to scripture and the earliest known civilizations. And yet, in most kitchens today, onions are treated as background, something you sweat in a pan before the real ingredients go in. Nobody names their meal after the onion. But the people wandering that desert didn't mention it as an afterthought. They named it as something worth missing. Maybe it's time we stopped burying it at the bottom of the pot and started remembering why it earned a place in Scripture in the first place. In the book of Numbers, chapter 11, verse 5, garlic closes out that same list of foods the Israelites longed for, right alongside cucumbers, melons, onions, and leeks. 5 foods named together in one single cry of homesickness. Garlic earns its place at number 9 here, and it might be the most fought-over food on this entire list. Ancient Egyptian workers were reportedly given rations of garlic to keep up their strength during long, physically brutal labor. And there are records of garlic being valuable enough to trade like a form of payment. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote that inscriptions on the Great Pyramid itself recorded exactly how much garlic, onion, and radish were spent feeding the laborers who built it. A detail so specific, it suggests garlic rations were tracked with real precision, almost like a payroll ledger. That's not a small detail. People don't barter over something they consider ordinary. The compound responsible for garlic's sharp smell and taste is called allicin, and it's released only when a clove is crushed or chopped, never when it's left whole. Allicin has been studied for its connection to healthy circulation. And good circulation matters here because your kidneys rely on steady, efficient blood flow to filter what they need to filter, hour after hour. Modern studies have also looked at allicin's relationship to healthy cholesterol levels, another factor that indirectly affects how much strain your cardiovascular system, and by extension, your kidneys, deal with day to day. Garlic remains one of the most researched plants in the world today, with thousands of published studies, yet most people still reach for it purely out of habit rather than any sense of its long, documented history. Traditionally, garlic has been crushed into warm water or folded into broths as a simple, everyday way to support the body through seasonal changes, long before anyone had a name for the compound doing the work. These days, garlic mostly gets treated as a flavor base, something you toss in a pan without a second thought. But somewhere along the way, we forgot that this small, sharp bulb was once considered worth trading like currency. It didn't lose its value. We just stopped paying attention to it. I'll admit something. Most people can't actually tell a leek apart from a large green onion. And that mix-up might be part of why leeks never get the credit they deserve. But in the book of Numbers, chapter 11, verse 5, leeks are named directly, right alongside cucumbers, melons, onions, and garlic, as one of the foods the Israelites grieved leaving behind in Egypt. Leeks grew abundantly along the Nile, thriving in that rich, well-watered soil. And ancient Egyptians used them constantly, not just as food, but reportedly in early medicinal preparations too. The soil along the Nile was replenished every single year by the river's flooding, which is part of why leeks, along with onions and garlic, grew so reliably there. Once the Israelites were out in the open desert, none of that rich, self-renewing soil existed anymore, which is exactly why a food like this became something to genuinely mourn. Here's what sets leeks apart from their onion cousins. They carry a gentler, sweeter flavor, but a similar profile of natural compounds that have traditionally been associated with supporting the body's fluid balance. Something like a mild, food-based diuretic effect. That matters for your kidneys because they're constantly managing how much fluid your body holds onto and how much it releases. Ancient physicians in the region also recommended leeks specifically for people recovering from illness, believing their gentle, easily digested nature made them ideal when the body needed nourishment without heaviness. That reputation as a recovery food has quietly persisted in some traditional kitchens, even if most people today have no idea that's where the custom came from. Traditionally, leeks have been simmered slowly into broths and soups, cooked low and long until they nearly dissolve, releasing their flavor gradually rather than all at once. That slow, patient preparation says something about how people once related to food. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted. Today, leeks mostly show up as a fancy garnish on a restaurant plate, treated almost like a decoration instead of a food people once relied on for daily nourishment. Let's move from something that grew along a riverbank to a food with a very different kind of story, one tied to a single, dramatic moment of regret. A young man walks in from the field, exhausted, starving, and he smells something simmering on the fire. That single bowl of stew is what convinces him to trade away his entire inheritance. That's the story behind lentils, found in the book of Genesis, chapter 25, verse 34, where Esau sells his birthright to his brother Jacob for, of all things, a bowl of red lentil stew. It's one of the most famous meals in all of Scripture, and it's easy to read past the fact that it was lentils that carried that much weight in the story. Lentils were, and still are, one of the most widely cultivated crops across the entire region, stretching from Egypt through Canaan, prized specifically because they could be dried and stored for months without spoiling, making them a reliable food source during long journeys or lean seasons. Exactly the kind of practical value that would matter to a family fleeing danger. Lentils are small, but they're dense with plant-based protein, fiber, and iron. The kind of steady, slow-burning nutrition that would genuinely satisfy someone who'd been working outdoors all day. That fiber content matters here too, because a diet that supports healthy digestion also tends to ease some of the everyday workload your kidneys carry. Traditionally, lentils have been simmered into thick stews, very similar to the one in that story, often for hours, until they break down into something rich and filling. It's one of the few foods on this list you can trace, almost exactly, back to a specific bowl in a specific story. Lentils also happen to be one of the very few crops mentioned by name in more than one book of the Bible, appearing again in the list of provisions brought to King David, which tells you this wasn't a one-time mention, but a food that mattered across generations and across very different circumstances. And yet, today, lentils are treated as a budget ingredient, something you buy when you're trying to stretch a grocery bill, rather than a food important enough to be the centerpiece of one of the most consequential meals in the entire Bible. Maybe that bowl of stew deserves a little more respect than we've been giving it. Remember that teaser from the very beginning, about a king running for his life through the wilderness? This is that food. In the second book of Samuel, chapter 17, verse 28, we read about supplies brought to King David and his men while he was fleeing his own son, Absalom, during one of the most painful chapters of his reign. Among those supplies, beans, specifically the kind we now call fava beans, alongside lentils and other simple provisions. Think about that for a second. This wasn't a royal banquet. This was survival food, carried out to a king who had lost his throne, his home, and very nearly his family, all at once. That same passage in 2 Samuel also lists honey, cheese, and grain sent out to David's exhausted men. But it's the beans and lentils that historians point to as the real backbone of that relief effort, dense enough in nutrition to actually sustain an army on the move, rather than just offering a brief comfort. Fava beans are dense in plant protein and folate, nutrients your body needs for basic everyday repair and energy. Exactly what a fleeing army would have needed to keep moving. There's something almost humbling about that. One of the most powerful kings in Scripture, at his lowest point, kept alive by the same humble bean you can buy today for barely any money at all. Fava beans have also been found preserved in archaeological digs across the ancient Near East, sometimes in surprisingly good condition, which tells us just how central they were to the ordinary diet of the time. Not a rare treat, but a genuine staple people relied on. Traditionally, fava beans have been slow-cooked with olive oil and simple herbs, a preparation that's barely changed in thousands of years across the Middle East. In most modern kitchens, though, beans like these get filed under poverty food, something people associate with hard times rather than survival and strength. But David's story tells a different version. Sometimes the humblest food in the pantry is exactly what keeps you standing when everything else has fallen apart. Once a year, an entire family gathers around a table, and on that table sits a plate of bitter greens, eaten on purpose, not because they taste good, but because they're supposed to hurt a little. That's the tradition tied to Exodus, chapter 12, verse 8. Where God instructs the Israelites to eat the Passover lamb together with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. Most scholars believe those bitter herbs included varieties of lettuce, along with other sharp leafy greens common to the region at the time. Some traditions identify these bitter herbs even more specifically as horseradish, chicory, or dandelion greens, plants that share that same sharp, slightly harsh flavor profile that makes your eyes water a little. By design, so the bitterness of the meal actually matches the bitterness of the memory it represents. The bitterness wasn't a mistake in the recipe. It was the entire point, a physical reminder of the bitterness of slavery in Egypt, something you were meant to taste, not just hear about. What's easy to miss is that these same bitter greens carry real, practical value beyond the symbolism. Bitter leafy greens have traditionally been used to support the body's natural detoxification processes, largely because of their high water content and specific plant compounds that encourage healthy digestion, both of which take some of the pressure off your kidney's daily filtering work. Traditionally, these greens were eaten raw, dipped briefly in salt water, a preparation almost identical to how bitter herbs are still served at Passover tables today. And yet, outside of that one night a year, most people never think about bitter greens at all, let alone what they might be doing quietly for the body. A food remembered once a year for what it represents, forgotten the other 364 days for what it actually does. Quick thing before we keep going. If you want the real version of these plants, not some over-processed supplement, we've linked exactly where to find them, fresh or dried, in the description below. Now, let's finish this list, because the next few foods take us from ancient survival rations into something even Jesus himself talked about by name. Jesus once said something surprising about a plant you probably have growing in a pot on your windowsill right now. In the book of Matthew, chapter 23, verse 23, Jesus calls out religious leaders of his day for being meticulous about tithing mint, dill, and cumin down to the smallest leaf, while neglecting what he called weightier matters, like justice and mercy. It's easy to focus on the criticism in that verse and completely miss the detail sitting right inside it. These three herbs, mint, dill, and cumin, were valuable enough that people were tithing them with precision. Mint, in particular, has been used for thousands of years, across nearly every culture in the region, as a way to support healthy digestion after a heavy meal. Ancient Greek and Roman writers described mint being scattered across dining tables, specifically because its aroma was believed to aid digestion after a large meal, a practice that lines up almost exactly with how mint has been used across the wider ancient world, not just within scripture. Mint spreads easily and grows almost anywhere it's planted, which may be part of why it became such an ordinary, everyday herb. Easy to take for granted, specifically because it was never scarce or difficult to find. And digestion matters here, because a body that's processing food efficiently puts less strain on the kidneys, which are quietly filtering the byproducts of everything you eat and drink. Traditionally, mint has been steeped into warm tea, chewed fresh, straight off the stem, or crushed into water as a simple, everyday tonic. Nothing complicated about it. These days, mint mostly shows up as a garnish on a dessert plate, or flavor in gum and toothpaste, treated as decoration rather than the herb precise enough to be tithed in scripture. Number 4 on our list. And we're not done with that verse yet, because the next two foods come from that exact same sentence. Right alongside mint in that same verse, Matthew chapter 23 verse 23, sits dill, the feathery, fragrant herb most people today only associate with pickles. But long before pickle jars existed, dill was being tithed as something valuable in its own right. Historically, dill has been used across the ancient Near East as a gentle, traditional support for fluid balance in the body, often prepared as a warm infusion rather than eaten on its own. Ancient Egyptian medical texts, some of the oldest medical writing that still survives today, describe dill being used specifically to calm the stomach after eating, a detail that lines up closely with how it would later be tithed as something valuable enough to track carefully in the book of Matthew. That kind of traditional diuretic use lines up closely with what your kidneys are doing every hour, managing exactly how much water your body holds and releases. Dill seeds, distinct from the feathery leaves, were also used separately in some ancient preparations, valued for a slightly different, more concentrated version of the same traditional digestive support the fresh herb offered. Dill also carries a distinctly different flavor from mint, sharper, almost citrus-like, which is part of why ancient cooks used the two herbs for very different purposes, despite growing them side by side in the same garden beds. Traditionally, dill was steeped fresh, added at the very end of cooking so its delicate oils wouldn't cook away. A small detail that shows how carefully people once handled a plant we now mostly reach for out of a jar of brine. It's strange to think that a plant precise enough to be tithed by religious leaders 2,000 years ago is the same plant most people today only encounter floating in pickle juice. Number 3. And there's one more herb. Left in that very same verse, arguably the most surprising one. The book of Isaiah, chapter 28, verses 25 through 27, gives an oddly specific description of how cumin was harvested in ancient times, explaining that it wasn't crushed under a heavy threshing wheel like wheat, but beaten gently with a lighter stick, because rough handling would damage the tiny, delicate seeds. That level of detail, in a book focused mostly on prophecy and warning, tells you cumin mattered enough that the method of harvesting it was worth writing down. Cumin was valuable enough in the ancient world that it was sometimes used as a form of payment for taxes or rent, a detail that helps explain why the prophet Isaiah bothered describing its harvest method in such specific detail in the first place, since a crop worth that much was worth protecting from careless handling.
Cumin seeds are small, but they carry a concentrated dose of antioxidants, along with compounds that have traditionally supported healthy digestion, the same digestive support that indirectly eases what your kidneys have to process afterward. Traditionally, cumin seeds were lightly toasted before grinding, a step that unlocks their deep, warm aroma, something cooks across the ancient Near East understood instinctively, long before anyone had a word for essential oils or aromatic compounds. Cumin's distinctive, slightly smoky aroma made it valuable not just in cooking, but reportedly in some ancient embalming practices as well, another sign of how broadly this small seed was used across daily life in the ancient world. Today, cumin sits in almost every spice rack in the world, used constantly, and yet almost nobody remembers that scripture once described the delicate, careful way its seeds needed to be handled. We've kept using it. We just forgot why it once required so much care. Number 2. And this brings us to the final item on the list, the one this entire video has been building toward. Here it is, the food this entire video has been building toward. In the book of Exodus, chapter 16, verse 31, and again in the book of Numbers, chapter 11, verse 7, Scripture describes manna, the bread that fell from heaven every single morning for 40 straight years in the wilderness, by comparing its appearance directly to coriander seed. Not to gold, not to some rare treasure, to a small, ordinary seed sitting in kitchens all over the ancient world. Whatever manna actually was, whatever miracle was happening every morning outside those tents, the writers of Scripture reached for a food people already knew, coriander, to help them describe something they didn't fully have words for. Nobody in that camp had ever seen anything like manna before it appeared. And nobody has ever fully agreed on exactly what it was made of since. But the writers reaching for coriander seed as the closest comparison tells you they were describing something small, pale, and almost unassuming in appearance. Not something flashy or golden, just a quiet little seed covering the ground every single morning. Coriander seed itself carries a quiet reputation of its own, rich in antioxidants and traditionally used across multiple cultures as a gentle support for digestion and healthy fluid balance. The same kind of steady, background support your kidneys rely on every day, whether you ever think about them or not. It's one of the oldest spices still in common use today, found in cooking traditions stretching from the Middle East through South Asia and into the Mediterranean, a reach that's rare for any single ingredient. Traditionally, the seeds were toasted lightly and ground fresh, released only right before cooking, because their flavor fades quickly once exposed to air. There's something almost poetic about that. The food chosen to describe a daily miracle that fed an entire nation for 40 years is a plant most of us have sitting in a spice jar right now, completely unnoticed. Maybe that's the real lesson buried in this entire list. The most remarkable things aren't always loud. Sometimes they're small, familiar, and sitting quietly on your own kitchen shelf, waiting for you to actually pay attention. So there you have it, 12 vegetables and herbs, straight out of Scripture,
still sitting in ordinary kitchens today, from cucumbers wept over in a desert to a tiny seed used to describe bread falling from heaven. None of these foods needed a laboratory to matter, and none of them needed to be rare or expensive either. If any of these are already in your kitchen, tell us which one surprised you most in the comments. And remember, the God who fed his people daily in the wilderness placed these quiet gifts in the ground for you too. If this gave you something worth thinking about, subscribe and ring the bell, because next week we'll uncover 12 more.